In the quiet, unremarkable town of Blackwell, Oklahoma, life moved slowly and unhurriedly. Here, among the small houses with manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, news usually traveled quickly. But one story struck like lightning at the heart of this small community. In early 2007, local residents were shocked by an unexpected announcement. 19-year-old Daniel King, a young man who had just graduated from high school and was known in town for his work on a local farm, had decided to tie the knot with 75-year-old Elizabeth Marriott. Elizabeth, a widow known to many as a quiet and dignified woman, had lived in the town for many years and was well respected by her neighbors. The news of the upcoming wedding caused a storm of discussion. Some claimed that it was true love, but most of the townspeople were puzzled and even outraged by such an unusual union. Rumors spread with incredible speed, and soon no house in Blackwell remained aloof from the discussion of this topic. Journalists from local news stations did not miss the opportunity to cover this event, and the wedding became the main headline of all news broadcasts. However, despite the negative reaction, the wedding still took place. In a small hall of the local church, surrounded by a few friends and relatives, Daniel and Elizabeth said their vows. Pastor James Williams, a man who had led services at the church for many years, did not hide his surprise when he was asked to perform the ceremony. He knew Elizabeth as a godly woman, but he never imagined that she would want to marry a young man who was young enough to be her grandson. After the ceremony, the newlyweds moved into Elizabeth's house on the outskirts of the city. The house, surrounded by a high fence, looked lonely and abandoned. Many neighbors noticed that Daniel immediately began to improve the house, putting effort into its restoration. For many, this seemed strange because the house clearly belonged to Elizabeth, and it was unclear why the young man was spending so much effort on improving it. Events unfolded gradually, but the tension in the town grew. People could not understand what could have pushed Daniel to such a step. Was it because of money? After all, everyone knew that Elizabeth was a fairly wealthy woman. Or was it love that no one could understand? These questions haunted the residents of Blackwell, and they asked themselves more and more every day. Despite the negative reception of the wedding among locals, Daniel and Elizabeth continued to live together. They rarely appeared in public, which further fueled interest in their union. Neighbors saw them only occasionally when they went grocery shopping or to church. Daniel seemed happy, if a little tense, and Elizabeth continued to lead her normal, quiet life. However, behind this calm exterior, something dark was hiding. Inside this house, behind closed doors, something was happening that would later shake the entire town. But at this stage, no one suspected that their wedding would only be the beginning of a terrible tragedy that would leave a deep mark on the history of the small town of Blackwell. The villagers continued to gossip and discuss this strange union, not knowing that they would soon face events that would forever change their understanding of love, trust, and betrayal. It was only a few weeks after the wedding when life in the small town of Blackwell changed dramatically. It all started when neighbors noticed a strange silence and quiet around Elizabeth's house. Usually Daniel, despite his secretiveness, was gardening or doing something around the house, but no one had seen him in the last few days. This fact immediately attracted the attention of a neighbor, Sam Richards, an elderly man who lived across the street and often watched what was happening in the neighboring yards. Sam was an observant and suspicious man. He noticed that for several days, neither Daniel nor Elizabeth had appeared in front of the house. It became increasingly strange that there was no sound or movement in the house, and even in the morning there was an uncollected newspaper on the porch. Sam, worried about this state of affairs, decided to check if everything was all right. In the morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon, Sam approached the Marriott house. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. Then he tried to look through the windows, but the thick curtains did not allow him to see what was happening inside. Sam felt that something was wrong, and his anxiety grew stronger with each passing minute. Deciding he needed to take action, he called the police. The dispatcher recorded his complaint, and within minutes, officers arrived. A patrol car pulled up slowly to the house, and two officers, James Carter and Sarah Miller, got out to survey the area. Sam, who remained nearby, watched their actions, hoping his fears would prove unfounded. The officers knocked on the door several times and rang the bell, but there was no answer. After a brief discussion, they decided to enter the house, Using standard police tactics, they forced the door open and cautiously entered, prepared for anything. The house was eerily quiet. The officers first searched the living room and kitchen but found nothing out of the ordinary. However, as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, they noticed a faint odor that became increasingly distinct. It was a smell they knew all too well, unfortunately, the smell of death. They approached the bedroom, the door of which was slightly ajar. It was dark inside, barely illuminated by daylight filtering through the closed curtains. The officers cautiously entered the room, and soon a horrifying sight met their gaze. On the bed, among the rumpled sheets and pillows, lay the body of a young man. It was Daniel. His face was twisted in a painful grimace, and a robe belt was tied tightly around his neck. Everything indicated that death had occurred several days ago. The officers immediately called for backup and reported the incident to the chief of police. Detectives and forensics officers soon arrived on the scene. The house was cordoned off, and a detailed evidence collection process began. The medical examiner, Dr. Emily Stone, quickly determined that the cause of death was strangulation, but a full analysis would require an autopsy. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Gibson, who had been assigned to lead the case, began questioning neighbors and acquaintances of Daniel and Elizabeth. Sam Richards, of course, was one of the first to be questioned. He told of his suspicions and how long he had not seen Daniel. His story only confirmed the police's fears that the young man's death was not accidental. Over the next few hours, the house was thoroughly examined. Forensic experts looked for any traces that might shed light on what had happened in the last days of Daniel's life. Fingerprints were lifted, traces on the floor, in the cupboards, and even on the windows were examined. Several odd details caught their attention. An unfinished cup of tea was standing in the kitchen, dirty dishes were left in the sink, and a dusty photo album lay on a shelf. Of particular interest was Elizabeth herself. Where was she at the time? Why wasn't she home when the murder occurred? These questions remained unanswered, each one making the detective's job more difficult. As Daniel's body was moved to the morgue, Laura Gibson began to form her first theory of what had happened. However, Elizabeth's absence and the lack of clear evidence left many questions unanswered. One thing was clear. This murder could not have been the work of a random criminal. Too many coincidences indicated that it was a carefully planned action. The death of Daniel King was a puzzle for the Blackwell police to solve. However, the deeper they delved into the details of this strange couple's lives, the more questions arose. Everyone knew that they had a long and confusing road ahead, where every little detail would have to be given meaning. After the discovery of Daniel King's body in his own home, the investigation began with a thorough collection of evidence that would shed light on the mysterious circumstances of his death. The house where the tragedy occurred was temporarily closed to everyone except police officers and forensic experts, who worked non-stop to try to gather as much information as possible. When forensic scientists began examining the house, they paid particular attention to the state of the bedroom where the body was found. The first thing they noticed was the disarray on the bed. The sheets were crumpled, and the pillows appeared to have been thrown out in frustration. This immediately aroused the detective's suspicions, as such marks often indicate a struggle. But there were no traces in the room that would clearly indicate the presence of an intruder. No footprints or footprints on the floor. Dr. Emily Stone, a forensic pathologist, conducted an initial examination of the body, looking for clues that might help the investigation. The sash from the robe that had been used to strangle Daniel was tightly tied, which could indicate that the killer had been physically strong or had acted with particular determination. However, there were no signs of a struggle on the victim's body, other than the marks of strangulation. This could mean that Daniel had either been taken by surprise or trusted his killer enough not to resist. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Gibson and her team continued to search the rest of the house. In the kitchen, they found a half-finished cup of tea left on the table. Forensic scientists immediately seized the cup for analysis, hoping to find fingerprints or traces of any substances on it. The food in the refrigerator was also untouched, which could indicate that Daniel or Elizabeth had not cooked in recent days. Interestingly, there were no signs of forced entry into the house. The doors and windows were locked from the inside, and it appeared that no one had forced their way into the house. This made it even more difficult for detectives, as the killer seemed to either know how to get in or was already inside when it happened. The detectives were particularly interested in photographs and documents found in one of the cabinets. There was an old family album of Elizabeth's, which captured her early years and previous marriages. Laura Gibson, leafing through the pages of the album, noticed that the photographs abruptly ended at a certain point in Elizabeth's life. This raised questions. Why did she stop documenting her life? What happened in her past that could shed light on her current situation? Elizabeth's financial documents and will were also found. They clearly stated that all of her property was to go to Daniel in the event of her death. This fact aroused serious suspicions among detectives, since the motive of inheritance became one of the possible motives for the murder. However, in this case, the situation turned out to be even more confusing. If Daniel was to inherit the entire fortune, why kill him? And most importantly, to whom will the property go now? While searching the house, detectives began interviewing neighbors and acquaintances of Elizabeth and Daniel. Sam Richards, a neighbor across the street, said that he had not seen any suspicious people near the house for several days before the body was discovered. However, he noted that he had heard strange sounds several times during the night, but did not attach any importance to them. Julia Vance, a local journalist, also conducted her own investigation, trying to gather more information for her articles. She visited several local businesses and spoke with people who knew Daniel and Elizabeth. During her research, she learned that Daniel was a private person who was reluctant to talk about his future plans. This fact fueled interest in his motivations for marrying Elizabeth, but no one could provide concrete answers. However, the police were most interested in one of the bank managers who handled Elizabeth's accounts. He said that in the days before his death, Daniel had come to the bank and tried to access his wife's bank accounts. However, he encountered problems because he did not have the appropriate authority. This information led detectives to consider the possibility that Daniel may have been involved in some kind of financial fraud that could have led to his murder. Each new clue, each new fact made the investigation more and more complicated. Detective Laura Gibson understood that they were dealing with a very complicated case, where each step forward could lead to a new dead end. But despite this, she was determined to uncover the truth and bring the investigation to an end. While experts continued to analyze the evidence, detectives continued to try to find Elizabeth. Her disappearance became increasingly suspicious, and police began to widen the scope of the search, checking all possible places where she might be hiding. At this point, the investigation had reached a dead end. Despite the evidence found and the interviews conducted, the overall picture remained unclear. But Laura Gibson knew she had to keep looking for answers, because every new discovery could be the key that would unlock the mystery of this tangled story. As the investigation continued, detectives began to focus on potential suspects. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else, the slightest hint of unusual behavior could be a clue. However, this case was far more complex, and finding direct connections or motives was not easy. The first and most obvious suspect was Elizabeth Marriott herself. Her sudden disappearance immediately after Daniel's death was extremely suspicious. Detective Laura Gibson knew that people could run away when they felt threatened or in danger. But what if Elizabeth was hiding not out of fear but because she was involved in this crime? There were many questions, and they demanded answers immediately. To learn more about Elizabeth's past, detectives turned to archival records and documents. They found that Elizabeth Marriott had been married 3 times, and all of her previous husbands had died under strange circumstances. Although none of these cases were related to crime, the fact that she had already lost several spouses raised serious suspicions. Perhaps Daniel was the latest victim in a long chain of tragedies surrounding this woman's life. Detectives also began looking into the financial side of the case. Financial documents found in the house indicated that Elizabeth was a wealthy woman, but she did not manage her own finances. All of her assets were managed by outside advisors, which was unusual for such a detail-oriented woman. This could mean that someone else had access to her finances, and perhaps that person had a motive to eliminate Daniel in order to maintain control of her fortune. An examination of Elizabeth's accounts and banking transactions led to some surprising discoveries. In the last months of her life, there were many strange transactions in her accounts. Large transfers to accounts registered in offshore zones were recorded. This could indicate an attempt to hide money or move it to places inaccessible to investigators. However, despite these alarming signs, there was no direct evidence linking these transactions to Daniel's murder. Other suspects included the bank manager who handled Elizabeth's accounts. He was one of the few people who knew about her financial transactions and could have access to her money. When questioned, he admitted that he had financial problems and had asked Elizabeth several times to lend him a large sum of money, but she refused. This refusal could have been the motive for the crime if the manager hoped that Daniel's death and Elizabeth's disappearance would give him access to her wealth. However, it was difficult to prove his involvement in the murder, as he had an airtight alibi for the time of Daniel's death. The detectives also began to look into Daniel's past. It soon became clear that he had had some trouble with the law as a teenager. He had been on the police radar several times for minor crimes and infractions. But these offenses were in the past, and at the time of his wedding, Daniel seemed like an exemplary young man looking for a new life. However, one fact from his past haunted the detectives. Daniel had once been involved with a group of young people engaged in illegal transactions. This led the detectives to believe that perhaps his past had come back to haunt him. Perhaps one of his former acquaintances had decided to take advantage of his marriage to a wealthy woman to achieve their own goals. Also among the suspects were Elizabeth's close relatives, who may have had a grudge against her new husband. The relatives believed that the young groom may have married Elizabeth solely for her fortune. Some of them expressed dissatisfaction with the marriage even before it took place. They were sure that Daniel wanted to take advantage of the older woman's trust in order to seize her money and property. Therefore, they may have had a motive to eliminate Daniel in order to protect the interests of the family. One such relative was Elizabeth's nephew, John Marriott, a man with a difficult character and a tendency to act aggressively. He openly expressed his displeasure with his aunt's decision to marry a young man and even threatened him during one of the family gatherings. John was also Elizabeth's sole heir before her marriage to Daniel, and his position in this regard had noticeably worsened. Detectives suspected that John might have a motive for the murder, but his alibi for the time of the crime was also reliable. While detectives were investigating possible motives and connections between the suspects, they were also continuing to search for Elizabeth. Her disappearance remained a mystery. Police checked all of her known contacts and addresses, but none of them yielded any results. This caused even more concern as time went on, and hopes of finding her alive faded with each passing day. However, one night, Detective Laura Gibson received an anonymous call. The person on the other end of the line claimed to have seen an elderly woman matching Elizabeth's description on the outskirts of town. He had noticed her while driving past an abandoned warehouse and thought it odd that a woman her age was there alone. This information could prove crucial, and Laura immediately went to the scene, hoping to finally find an answer to the main question. Where did Elizabeth go, and what role did she play in this tragedy? Thus, the investigation gradually took the form of a complex mosaic, where each new fact could either reveal the truth or lead the detectives to another dead end. Laura Gibson understood that they still had a long way to go before they could solve all the mysteries surrounding the death of Daniel King and the disappearance of his mysterious wife. After an anonymous tip-off about Elizabeth's possible whereabouts, Detective Laura Gibson immediately headed to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Blackwell. The place had long since been abandoned, and most residents gave it a wide berth. When Laura pulled up to the warehouse, she noticed that it did indeed look abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the front doors were rusted from age and weather. However, tracks on the dusty road leading to the warehouse indicated that someone had recently been there. Laura got out of the car and turned on her flashlight, slowly walking to the front door. She gave it a little push, and the door creaked open. It was dark inside, and cold air filled with the smell of damp and dust hit her. Laura knew the place needed to be thoroughly examined and called for backup to conduct a full search of the building. When the team arrived, detectives and forensics began to examine the warehouse. They searched every room, but most were empty, filled only with old boxes and trash. However, in one of the back rooms, they found something that immediately caught their attention: a blanket on the floor and an empty bottle of water next to it. Footprints on the floor indicated that someone had been there recently. Elizabeth seemed to have been there, but where could she have gone? Laura looked around the room, trying to find any clues. There were scratches on one of the walls, as if someone had tried to scratch something into the surface. It could have been a sign of desperation or an attempt to leave a message. Forensics took fingerprints from the bottle and the wall, hoping that they would help confirm the identity of the person who had been there. While the evidence was being analyzed in the lab, Laura returned to the station to continue her investigation. Questions remained. If Elizabeth was here, why was she hiding? Why didn't she seek help from her friends or the police? These questions forced Laura to rethink everything they knew about the case. Meanwhile, detectives continued to look into Elizabeth's financial transactions. One of the oddities was that several large sums of money were transferred to unknown accounts overseas. These transfers began immediately after her wedding to Daniel, which led detectives to suspect that someone in Elizabeth's circle might be using her to defraud them. Perhaps Daniel didn't even know he was involved in some kind of financial scam and became a victim when he tried to access the accounts. Laura also began to suspect that Elizabeth might not just be a victim, but an active participant in this game. Her past, with 3 previous husbands, all of whom died under strange circumstances, was becoming increasingly suspicious. Perhaps she was using her marriage to Daniel as a cover for something darker. Soon, the detectives received the results of the fingerprints found in the warehouse. They did indeed belong to Elizabeth Marriott, confirming that she had been in the warehouse. However, where she went next remained a mystery. There were no traces of how she could have left the place. Laura realized that someone could have helped her escape, or that she had deliberately left false traces to throw the police off. At the same time, the investigation began to focus on the bank manager and Elizabeth's relatives. The bank manager, despite his solid alibi, continued to raise suspicions. Laura decided to conduct a deeper investigation into his financial transactions and connections. It was discovered that the manager was connected to several offshore accounts that received money from different sources. This could indicate that he was involved in a larger financial scam that was exploiting Elizabeth and her wealth. As for Elizabeth's relatives, especially John Marriott, they began to show increasing signs of nervousness and anxiety. During additional questioning, John changed his story several times, which made the detectives suspicious that he was hiding something. Laura decided to request judicial permission to wiretap his phone calls and examine his financial transactions. Day after day, the investigation gained momentum, but clarity became less and less. Each new fact opened new questions, and Laura began to understand that this case was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. But despite all the difficulties, she was determined to see it through to the end. After all, behind all these tangled tracks, there was a truth that needed to be revealed in order to restore justice and punish the guilty. The tense atmosphere surrounding the case grew stronger with each passing day. Rumors and speculations began to circulate in the small town, which only fueled interest in what was happening. Everyone understood that something important was about to happen soon, which would finally shed light on this dark and confusing case. And just when it seemed like the case was starting to hit a dead end, Laura received another unexpected call that could turn the entire investigation upside down. This call would lead her to the final, most important discovery that would reveal the true motives and hidden forces behind this horrific crime. After weeks of intense investigation and evidence gathering, Detective Laura Gibson finally found herself on the verge of solving this twisted case. The call she received came from an unknown informant who claimed to have information about Elizabeth's whereabouts and what really happened in the King home that fateful night. The informant, who declined to give his name, provided Laura with details previously unknown to investigators. He said Elizabeth had long been involved with a criminal group involved in money laundering through offshore accounts. Her 3 previous husbands had not died by accident, but were part of a carefully thought-out plan to cover up the financial fraud. He said Daniel King, unaware of Elizabeth's real motives, became her final victim when he tried to interfere in her affairs. Laura immediately relayed this information to her team, and the investigation began to branch out. Detectives soon discovered that the call was indeed corroborated by the warehouse findings and bank transactions. Wiretaps on John Marriott's phone calls revealed his involvement in financial fraud, and his connection to Elizabeth was much deeper than just a family relationship. The real breakthrough, however, was when Laura tracked down Elizabeth. She was in a small town on the Texas border, hiding under an assumed name. Laura and her team immediately went there and arrested Elizabeth. Elizabeth was much calmer during her arrest than anyone had expected. She knew the truth would come out eventually, and she seemed prepared for it. When questioned, Elizabeth partially confessed to her crimes, although she continued to claim that she did not kill Daniel. She claimed that Daniel had accidentally strangled himself with the sash of his robe, and that she had only tried to hide the fact to protect her reputation and avoid drawing attention to her financial affairs. However, forensic examination showed that Daniel's death was violent, and that he had indeed been murdered. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that John Marriott, having learned of Daniel's death, had taken advantage of the situation to cover his tracks in the financial transactions, hoping that Elizabeth would take all the blame. However, his involvement in the fraud was fully revealed, and he was also arrested. The Daniel King case became a high-profile trial in the small town of Blackwell. The trial caused a huge public outcry. Elizabeth Marriott was sentenced to life in prison for murder and financial crimes. John Marriott also received a severe punishment for his part in the scheme and attempt to cover up his actions. The aftermath of this case reverberated throughout the town. Little Blackwell, which had once been a quiet and peaceful place, now became known as the town where one of the darkest and most twisted crime stories unfolded. People who knew Elizabeth and Daniel could not believe that such dark secrets were hidden behind the facade of a calm and respectable life. Detective Laura Gibson, having completed the investigation, was recognized for her work and for being able to bring the case to an end despite all the difficulties and obstacles. This case became one of the most significant in her career, and it forever changed her attitude towards life and how difficult it can sometimes be to see the truth behind the mask that people wear. The disclosure of all the details of this case also caused a wide public resonance in the media, which led to changes in the legislation of the state of Oklahoma, aimed at strengthening control over financial transactions and protecting the elderly from possible abuse by fraudsters. Thus, the case of Daniel King and Elizabeth Marriott became not only a tragic story, but also an important lesson for society, reminding us how fragile human destinies can be and how important it is to remain vigilant, even if everything seems simple and obvious.